Good afternoon, students. After the midterm, we are now moving to the second half of our semester, and we're going to start with covering two chapters, chapters 7 and 8. They go in parallel. To put it simply, chapter 7 is talking about what is called political history. That is history about, people and events in politics, political parties, government, presidents, and wars and such things. Chapter 8 is covering the same time frame, and the time frame that we are talking about, well, let me just finish first. It's covering the same time frame, but from another angle, from the angle what is called social history. So chapters 7 and 8 cover basically the same time period, but from two different angles. Social history is about not about the history of people in government, people in power, but about what the ordinary people were doing. That includes economy, society, various relationships that exist within society. Most importantly, the relationship between men and women. But a couple of other things, what do people do, how they work, where they make money. That would be economy. And that's what's covered in chapter 8. So the time frame that we're talking about, you can have a look at slide number 4, the PowerPoint, that is called chapter 7 and 8, Democratic America. And the time frame is the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. So we are talking about some 24 years, 24 years roughly speaking. Each of these presidents served 2 terms. And there on the slide number 4, I divided, I added the presidents of George Washington and John Adams that we had in the previous chapter, chapter 6. But now we're doing with presidency of Thomas Jefferson from 1801 to 1809, presidency of James Madison from 1809 to 1817, and James Monroe from 1817 from 1825. What these 3 presidents have in common is the so-called Virginia dynasty. They were all members of the Democratic Republican Party, or that we call Democrats for short, but they were all members of the same political party, and they were in opposition to the people who came before them, namely George Washington and John Adams. George Washington was tried to be a non-partisan figure. He was not the only one. Most of the founders of the Republic, including Jefferson, thought that partisan life was not necessarily a good thing. But they believed that through open discussion in the Congress, that they would be able to come to the best solutions. It doesn't always work that way in politics, and that is what early Americans were finding out very quickly. So all these 3 presidents, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, came from the same party. They came from the same state, Virginia. And they're more or less advocated for the same vision of the country. Which brings us back to slide number 3. Pardon me for, I should probably reorder the slides, but anyways. Slide number 3, where we have pictures of Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. We talked about this before several times, most importantly during the Constitutional Convention, when the Founding Fathers were writing the Constitution of the United States. And we mentioned that there were 2 visions of the country. One was a vision of Alexander Hamilton, who's, a vision later associated with the Federalist Party, and it's a vision that later will be, especially during and after the Civil War, be taken over by the Republican Party. The Republican Party of the 19th century. Things changed a little bit in the 20th century. That's another story. But don't, just as a footnote, don't assume that what political parties stood for in the 19th century is the same thing that they stand for today. There is a lot of hoopla and rollovers in the realm of politics. But we are talking about two visions. Visions of Alexander Hamilton, which was the vision of the people on the east coast of the United States. Northeast, North England, New York, New Jersey, down to Philadelphia. That's the vision of an industrial and mercantile society. This is the vision that is was a common European vision. Namely, Europe was going through an industrial revolution, beginning in England beginning with the 1730s and 1750s and so on and so forth. Various inventions came about, including steam engine, the making of iron, cotton manufacturing, various machines associated with the making of cotton. So these were the first industry that were being created: mining, ironworks, cotton mills. That industry depended on transportation, on sailing ships, which was another element of technology that was invented. And very soon these sailing ships began to be supplanted by steamships. At first the steamships were sort of slow and unreliable and just awful places to be on. But gradually throughout the 19th century, steamships kind of take over, and when we come to the era of, Titanic was a steamship. So we're talking about 100 years from here. So anyways, that's the vision that appealed to the people in the large cities of the East Coast: Boston, Providence, Rhode Island, in Connecticut, New Haven, New York, Newark, Philadelphia, Baltimore. And that was one vision of society that was embraced by the Federalists. That vision was not popular. Outside of the East Coast, it wasn't popular. The majority of the country embraced the vision by Thomas Jefferson, which is a vision of an agrarian democracy, meaning that Thomas Jefferson was obsessed with democracy. This was why he's considered the father of the Democratic Party. And he wanted the Democratic Republic to last forever. And he believed that the basis of democracy is an independent farmer. So from Jefferson, we get a lot of these ideas about independence, about, do your own thing, don't rely on the state. Thomas Jefferson was a great opponent of central government, of central banking. A lot of these ideas are now advocated by Republicans, but I mentioned that things change in politics very quickly. So anyways, we're talking about these two visions of society. And what I'm trying to do here, and I'm trying to encourage you to do, is throughout this lecture, and actually throughout the rest of the semester, the chapters all the way to Civil War, follow these two visions of these two men. And you'll see that there was a conflict in American mind. Which one of these visions is the right one for our country? So anyways, that much as far as introduction. You have this summarized in the slide number 2. That's why I was going the kind of reverse direction. I was going from the slide number 4 to slide number 2. But what I just said is basically summarized on slide number 2, that you had two distinct visions of national future appearing during the presidency of George Washington, the Hamiltonian vision and the Jeffersonian visions. And these views became the staple of American politics. You have Alexander Hamilton, who advocated industrial revolution, blah, blah, blah. Hamilton wrote under the influence of Scottish economist Adam Smith, who in his work Wealth of Nations argued that prosperity comes from trade and not from hoarding precious metals. And it's very logical, it's very understandable that big mercantile cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia and Baltimore would love this idea, because these were cities that were based on trade. On the other hand, Thomas Jefferson was a Virginia politician who advocated agrarian democracy. And for Jefferson, a good society is not about society of merchants and manufacturers who, for Jefferson, were corrupt, dependent on other people, always trying to, Jefferson saw in independent merchants kind of the way we see car salesmen, pushy, annoying people who try to rip you off. But he wanted independent gentlemen farmers who were just honest, straightforward people. One of the consequences of Jefferson's vision was a great expansion of the United States. Jefferson, for his vision, needed land, and he wanted to provide land for Americans. And that idea determined a lot of the decisions that he made. It also explained why he was, in spite of all his rhetoric of liberty, compare him with George Washington, who was much less sweet talking about liberty and freedom, and yet did much more for it. And compare that with Thomas Jefferson, who talked wonderful words about democracy, about the Tree of Liberty, and so on and so forth, and yet was having affairs with Sally Hemings and one of his slaves, and never really thought about applying those principles to the slaves that were working in his household. So anyways, two visions, right? Couple of other things. We have slide number 5. That is external events. I emphasize this a lot, and I will continue to do so. Revolutions in France and Haiti dominated the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. I'm looking at slide number 5, Thomas Jefferson presidency from 1801 to 1809. He came to power very difficult. There was a very difficult close election. The system was not really worked through completely. There were a lot of uncertain things. There were no tickets. The elections for president and vice president were not kind of hooked together. Let's not get into details. But Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams in the elections of 1800, barely. The electoral college vote was undecisive, so the election was thrown into the Congress, into the House of Representatives, which voted 36 times or something like that, until eventually Thomas Jefferson won. So, anyways, he came to power under a shadow of undecisive victory in the elections, and immediately there was a lot of rumors about Thomas Jefferson, including the poster that you can see on slide number 6, where Jefferson is presented as grabbing the Constitution from the American eagle and trying to burn the Constitution at the altar of Gallic despotism. In international affairs, Jefferson was a sympathizer of revolutionary France, who at this time was under the rulership of Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleone. Actually, that's his own picture, Napoleon, right? Uh, Napoleon was a Corsican, therefore really an Italian, but Corsica became part of France a little bit earlier, so he was a French subject. And so originally his name was Napoleone Bonaparte, but he's known as Napoleon Bonaparte, president of the French Republic from 1799 to 1804. And you have slide number 8, coronation of Napoleon. Napoleon did a Napoleon thing, so to speak, something that only Napoleon could get away with. He was elected the president of the Republic, and then he crowned himself an emperor of the French. So, coronation of Napoleon in 1804. There are many reasons for it, and it disappointed a lot of people, including Thomas Jefferson, that he did so. But they remained on good terms. Jefferson's sympathies were with France, with revolutionary France, and France was at war with the rest of Europe over the ideas of the revolution, and was trying to impose the ideas of the revolution on other countries in Europe, including Spain, that will have a lot of effects actually on American politics, because Spanish colonies started to rebel against the rule of Napoleon in Spain, and will lead eventually to Mexican independence and so on and so forth. So things are kind of getting complicated, but we'll do it slowly and one by one. I said that the external influences, to recap, the external influences on the presidency of Thomas Jefferson was the revolution in France and Haiti. So they were connected to say the least. Haiti was a French colony. It's in the Caribbean, the island of Santo Domingo. The western part of the island is called Haiti today. And the eastern part of the island is Spanish speaking, and it's called the Dominican Republic. And Haiti was the most important French colony in the Caribbean. It had enormous sugar plantation with a great number of slaves. And that's where rebellion, you have a slide, look at slide number 10, slave rebellion to Haitian independence. So let me see, there is a bit of a typo over here, independence. So Haiti started a slave rebellion in 1791. That's really contemporary with the French Revolution. When the French Revolution started in 1789, it swept Haiti, it swept even the slaves in Haiti, who said, well, we like this idea of, we believe this truth is self-evident that all men are created equal. What a great idea. So why are we slaves and you are masters? Let's do something about it. And they did. They rebelled against their French owners, and very soon they kicked them out. So for the rest of the decade of the 1790, various powers, Britain for the most part, tried to conquer Haiti and take it over from France, and then the France was trying to negotiate with the leader of the Haitian rebellion called Toussaint Louverture. You'll find him down in the slides. So the British were trying to negotiate with him, and the French were trying to negotiate with him to fight the British, and then there was some 13 years of a complete mess. Well, actually, it was about 12 years of a complete mess. Until finally, in 1803, 1804, Napoleon decided to take back the island because it was just too profitable, and they decided to crush the slave rebellion, send an enormous army, actually an army that was bigger than the British sent to conquer the American Revolution in 1776, and afterwards 60,000 people were sent over to Haiti, very small country, and For a while, they were doing okay. They inflicted several of defeats to Haitian rebels, led by Louverture, Toussaint Louverture. And then they were defeated. They were defeated. So, and in 1804, Haiti became independent. Now, why is this important for us? I keep introducing these things from other parts of the world into American history. Well, they are very important for us. Look at what you have in the textbook. That's how our chapter 7 and 8 open. After chapter 7 open, Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800. And it says on August 30th, 1800, Gabriel, a slave, led fellow slaves into Richmond trying to take over Virginia government. Two slaves, a part of the conspiracy, Mosby Shepherd, told their owners about the plans. And he then warned the Virginia governor, James Monroe, the future president, who called out the state militia. And Gabriel was captured and betrayed again by another slave who was offered a reward by the state. There was a reward offered on his head, but that slave never received the reward for betraying Gabriel. So this is why Haitian revolution and rebellion was so important, because it had enormous effects on the American South. Namely, in the same way that Jefferson liked the idea of French revolutions and implemented them over here, the slaves in Haiti liked the ideas of the French Revolution, said, oh, all men are created equal, great, let's practice what we preach. And in the same way, the slaves in the American South tried to do the same, and they were crushed. Plus, there is an additional element. A good chunk of Haitians, white Haitians in this case, French, and free blacks, there was this category that didn't exist in the American South. It existed only in New Orleans and it's in a couple of other places, but not all black people were slaves at the time. In the South, yes, the great majority was, and there were no free black people. But in places like New Orleans, in places like Haiti, in places like Boston, New York, there were black people who were free, who were not slaves. There were some slaves, but that was on the wane. It was waning. It was on the way out very, very quickly because the society was changing and it was just unnecessary to keep slaves when you can have, servants and pay them for it. If you're, respectable merchants, why actually bother with the whole idea of slavery? This was not the case in the South. South was also being industrialized. In other words, it was becoming increasingly cash crop culture, basically agriculture that is not self-sufficient the way Jefferson envisioned it, but agriculture that produced cotton and tobacco, right? Cotton and tobacco. And for the Southerners, it was much more profitable to have slaves than to have to pay for that labor. Because if they had to pay, they couldn't compete with other cotton producing countries. So that was one of the big problems of America. And that's why this idea of two visions of America that we mentioned in the beginning, between the vision of Alexander Hamilton and the vision of Thomas Jefferson, keep following us now into the slave rebellions and into the ideas of, slide 11, Louisiana Purchase. Louisiana Purchase of 1803, because Louisiana Purchase was a momentous decision for America. If it were up to the Federalists and people like Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, Clinton DeWitt, governor of New York, John Quincy Adams, they wouldn't expand America into the West. They were not interested in it. They were into trade, for trade was done on the oceans, and they were not really interested in getting into the countryside. It was extremely expensive. It is often said that it's easier to transport something, well, it was cheaper to transport something from New York to London across the Atlantic than to transport something from New York to Pittsburgh or just across the Appalachian Mountains. To Scranton, Pennsylvania. Because in order to transport something from New York to Scranton, Pennsylvania, you had to put it on a pack animal, usually mule or a horse. Horses were actually more often mules, because a mule can carry more burden. And just so you have to have people to take the mules, to feed the mules, to load them and unload them. It was just extreme. It was much cheaper to get things to London and back than from New York to Scranton, Pennsylvania. But for the people who were living on the other side of the Appalachian Mountain, those people were farmers, and they were looking for land, and they were looking for land in order to make money. And therefore, they loved the Louisiana Purchase. They loved Jefferson. Louisiana Purchase happened in 1803 because of international situation. There was a war between Britain and France. Napoleon realized that he will have trouble keeping Haiti. That the British attempted several times during the slave rebellion to take over Haiti from France, and he realized that he won't be able to hold to the city of New Orleans and attached territories. And there was a lot of territory attached to the city of New Orleans, but basically what was attached was the whole of the Mississippi River Valley. And New Orleans is at the mouth of the Mississippi, actually at of where the river empties into the Gulf of Mexico, part of the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a city like no other in the United States. It's essentially a Spanish city that it has also this addition of having a lot of French people over there, and a lot of refugees coming into New Orleans from Haiti. Let me see, I have that. Right, so we have slide number 11, Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and you have New Orleans there at the bottom in the south, and the whole Mississippi River draining basin, Mississippi and Missouri rivers, and there is other rivers related to it, Arkansas River and the Red River in Texas and Oklahoma. And this swath of territory kind of came with New Orleans, and Napoleon, realizing that he's barely able to defend Haiti, he'll probably lose this. Therefore, better sell it to the Americans. And it was sold to the Americans, which immediately raises the question of politics. Let's go back to slide number 4. In slide number 4, you have the original 13 colonies, and then new states that were admitted into the Union. Vermont 1792, Kentucky 1792, Tennessee 1796, Ohio 1803, Louisiana in 1812, Indiana 1816, Mississippi 1817, Illinois 1818, Alabama 1819, Maine 1820, Missouri 1821. These all states were all admitted into the Union under the presidencies of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. they had a good reason for admitting those states. They were elected in order to admit those new states. They represented the people across the Appalachian Mountains from the inside of America. Look at, for example, those states one more time. Vermont was a free state. There was no slavery. Kentucky was a slave state. Tennessee was a slave state. Ohio was a free state. Louisiana was a slave state. Indiana was a free state. Mississippi was a slave state. Illinois was a free state. Alabama was a slave state. Maine was a free state. And Missouri was a slave state. Missouri is kind of, we'll get to that later on. It was a big of a pickle. In other words, once you have political parties, Democrats and the Federalists, they start counting the votes. And it's often more important to count the votes, count the votes, than to actually know what the people are feeling, and how they sort of have great ideas and stuff of that sort. So there was a constant bickering between the Democrats and the Federalists over whether new states should be admitted into the Union. And in general, they were against it, whereas Democrats were for it. They wanted more and more states. They wanted more and more land. And Louisiana Purchase was part of the same issue. Now, as they say, be careful what you wish for, you might get it. In other words, America got Louisiana. It was a good bargain. Napoleon made sure that it's not going to fall in the hands of the British, so it did the work for him. He had profit out of it. But look at the slide number 12. There we have on the left the leader of the slave revolt, Toussaint Ouverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who was later the first president of Haiti. Well, he sort of called himself an emperor of Haiti, but that was just an imitation of Napoleon. Let's have the look at the issue of refugees, because that will connect us with that Gabriel's rebellion that was there on the slide number 9 in Virginia. And it will explain to you how precarious and how difficult the situation was in the South. Between 1791 and 1803, 1,300 refugees arrived in New Orleans. That's basically double the population of the city. In January 1804, the black revolutionaries, who had been fighting for a dozen of years, crushed Napoleon's 60,000 army and proclaimed the nation of Haiti. The migration just of 1809 brought 2,731 whites to New Orleans, 3,102 free persons of color, and 3,226 enslaved Haitians to the city. 63% of New Orleans inhabitants were now black, either free black, what we call Creoles, or, well, in Louisiana they're called Creoles. That's one of the peculiarities of Louisiana. So the free blacks or enslaved black population. Among the nation's major city, only Charleston in South Carolina was a 53% black. Could be compared. Now, if New Orleans was something irrelevant, not so significant for the South, place like, I don't know, Kankakee, Illinois, or something of that sort, that wouldn't have been a problem. But New Orleans was the center of the South. It was the heart of the South. Why? Because of the Mississippi River. We mentioned about the transportation issues. And we mentioned that cotton needed to be transported down to a river to be transported, to be sent, to be sold to potential buyers. And the main cotton exchange in the South was actually in Memphis on the Mississippi, where various rivers actually come from both sides, from Arkansas and from Tennessee and from Kentucky and from Missouri. All those cotton growing areas brought their cotton to Memphis, where it was sold. And then from Memphis it was transported down to New Orleans. And in New Orleans it was repackaged, sold again. And New Orleans also had a huge cotton exchange and the slave market too. So a lot of landowners were actually, sold their cotton and bought slaves in New Orleans. And there from New Orleans, it would be transported to other parts of the world, sold to various cotton mills. And the cotton mills were in the north. The cotton mills were in Massachusetts. In Lowell, Massachusetts, there is a oldest cotton mill in the United States, and in England, actually Great Britain. England in particular, Manchester became the largest concentration of cotton mills in the world. The manufacturers of the world, Manchester, and well, it's connected with Liverpool, like Liverpool is the port of Manchester, basically. So the ships would come from New Orleans into Liverpool, and from Liverpool taken over into Manchester in cotton mills and made into cotton. So, in a way, all Southerners knew what was New Orleans. They went there. They saw what was going on. And they didn't really like what they saw. New Orleans was a very different society than the rest of the South. The rest of the South was the segregated society. There was no really intermingling between the whites and the blacks in the rest of the South. But in New Orleans there was. First, there were three races, not two races. There were, the white people, the free blacks, and the enslaved blacks. And very often the free blacks were richer than a lot of, poor whites. But there was it was a great it wasn't a black and white issue. It was shades of gray sort of a situation. These people intermingled. They lived with each other. There were all sort of interesting love affairs and illegitimate children. This and that, you name it. New Orleans, throughout history, even today, is a very, very fun place to be. So, but it wasn't liked in the South. It was something that the Southerners feared. They feared a lot. That the slaves would actually gain equality with the white slave owners. And that was a big no-no for most Southern slave owners, including Thomas Jefferson. Anyways, we have a further involvement, looking at the slide number 14, the further American involvement in the Franco-British War under Napoleon, where basically President Madison, in my opinion, sort of foolishly got us into the war with terrible consequences. One of the reasons that we entered into this war with Great Britain were the sympathies of the Virginia dynasty people, Jefferson, Madison, and so on and so forth, with France, with revolutionary France. They didn't like, Federalists were for Britain, and they didn't like the Federalists, they didn't like Britain. They thought, Federalists were putting America again under the British rule, and they didn't like it. So that's one of the reasons, but probably a more important reason was that, look at slide number 16. It says the opportunity to conquer Indian territories in the north and the south. Here you have a slide where Britain, this fat officer on the right, is bribing an American Indian to scalp poor Americans that is lying down in the blue coat on the ground. Look at the map of Louisiana Purchase under slide 11. And you have places that were not states at the time. So new states that were admitted to the Union were Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio. But Indiana was a territory, Illinois was a territory, Michigan was a territory, Mississippi was a territory. Louisiana Purchase was also a territory. It only became state in 1810. Actually, I've just noted that this map is really inaccurate because there is a slight mistake over there. It mentions there is a state of West Virginia over there, which was part of Virginia at the time. So West Virginia didn't exist as a state during the Louisiana Purchase, but just, that's a minor note. So the reason that actually James Madison and other Democrats pushed America into war against Britain was to take away these territories in the West from the Indians and their allies, British. The plan was actually even worse. The plan was, the hope of a lot of these radical Democrats were to basically conquer Canada and take it away from the British and enjoy Canada and the United States. That miserably failed in no small amount due to a great Indian leader. Oh, I don't have him here. Well, I should. Mr. Tecumseh. I'll correct this when we get to it on Friday lecture. So, right. Well, I mentioned I don't have a picture of him. Or maybe I should add a picture of him. That's slide number 17, and that's really a Tecumseh War, which is really part of the British-American War of 1812, even though it started a little earlier, but it's a part of the same struggle. You will see a lot, and that's what the politicians emphasized at the time, that the British were intercepting American ships and putting American soldiers in jail and all sort of mistreatments. Basically, British acted as if these people were still these people are still British subjects, and that's how they treated them, and that's one of the causes of the war, and it was. But actually, that wasn't the main cause of the war. The main cause of the war actually was the desire of American farmers in the West to take away Indian territories and to take Canada and to take New Orleans and to take all the other things that were related. So with the help of Tecumseh was a Shawnee leader in the Indiana Territory, and actually he was famous for, well, at the beginning of the war with the British, he helped the British to take over the Fort Wayne That's today Detroit. Detroit is located in Wayne County, Michigan, and there is a Fort Wayne, the oldest part of Detroit. And with the help of the Indians, the British took over Detroit, and Detroit is an extremely important strategical position. It controls the Great Lakes, and it's one of the reasons why the desired invasion of Canada by the Americans failed. The I'm try to rearrange this a little bit. Maybe not. So, let me just read it to you. Slides over here, slide number 14 and 15. We have slide number 14, American involvement in Franco-British War. That was the Embargo Act, enacted by President Jefferson. The Embargo Act was hated, especially people on the East Coast disliked it horribly, and they lost enormous amounts of money because of it. The Embargo Act of 1807 was a general embargo on all foreign nations enacted by the United States Congress with the intent to harm the United Kingdom and France during the Napoleonic Wars. And there is a bit of a dispute. I think Jefferson was maybe aiming to harm the British trade. The embargo was imposed in response to violation of United States neutrality, in which American merchants and their cargo were seized as contraband of war by the European navies. And there were a lot of these incidents, either by the French or the British, and it was really a dirty war on the seas that was conducted in this triangle, Great Britain, France, and the United States, where both Great Britain and France were trying to drag United States into the war, and sort of Jefferson sort of decided to take a step towards war. Embargo is considered an act of war, and that's how the British perceived it. So anyways, we have as a consequence, a couple of years later, the War of 1812. From the outbreak of the war with Napoleonic France, France had enforced a naval blockade to choke off neutral trade to France, which the US contested as illegal under international law. So the British were trying to blockade Napoleon, and the Americans were trying to get through the blockade, and they were stopped, and they didn't like it. To man the blockade, British took actually American merchant sailors into the Royal Navy, and American sentiment grew increasingly hostile toward Britain due to the incident. On June 18, 1812, President James Madison signed into law the American Declaration of War after heavy pressure from the war hawks in Congress. But Americans' defeats at the Siege of Detroit and at the Battle of Queenston Heights thwarted attempts to seize Upper Canada, and improved British morale. American attempts also failed to invade Lower Canada. So Upper Canada is Ontario, and Lower Canada is Quebec. We're talking about St. Lawrence River, so lower part of the river and the upper part of the river, and therefore Upper and Lower Canada. There was very unfortunate incident which kind of showed clearly British power at the time. While Britain was at war with Napoleon, it also captured capital of United States, and you have there on the slide number 20 the burning of the houses of the White. I think it's the White House. burned White House. Both of them were burned, the Capitol building, which was under construction, and the White House. So anyways, there are a lot of stories about American-British War of the War of 1812, including famously, the Siege of Baltimore and the Star-Spangled Banner, which was composed on that occasion. But rather than pressing you into knowing the details about the war and battles and this of sorts, I'd rather you understand why the war was fought. And the war was fought on paper over this issue of blockade. That was something that bothered the British and the French. That the Americans were trying to penetrate the British blockade and trade with France. On the other hand, the war was also fought up for the territory. American Indians were, like during the War of Independence, they liked the British better than the American settlers. They thought the British were better for them, and they were, to be honest. And so the war was also fought over territory. The end of the war, let's finish the war first. That would be the slide number 22. The war ended with the peace treaty, but there was an interesting battle that was called the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, which was fought after the war ended. So it was one of the strange things because of the delay of communication, how long it took, like 3 months. The news from Europe come over into the United States and come over into New Orleans. The British actually tried in 1815 to capture New Orleans from the Americans. And General Andrew Jackson became an American hero who saved New Orleans from the British. Still, if you go down to New Orleans, the main square, Place d'Armes, where the cathedral is, has a huge statue of Andrew Jackson over there, who defended the New Orleans against the British. But it wasn't just New Orleans. Southerners like Andrew Jackson was a man from Tennessee. And he was very interested in Mississippi Territory and further down south into Florida. The Southerners had their eye on Mississippi Territory, which was 2 states were made out of the Mississippi Territory, the states of Mississippi and the state of Alabama, and then Florida. Florida was also a big prize for the Southerners. So Andrew Jackson, for this reason, defended New Orleans against the British, among other things, of course. So was the war popular? No, it wasn't, especially in the Northeast. And that's that division in the country between the agrarian South and the industrial Northeast. To such an extent that there was a thing that here we have on slide 21 that is called Hartford Convention. That was an attempt by the northern states to leave the Union and actually to side with Great Britain. Let me read it to you, what it says here on the PowerPoint. The Hartford Convention was a series of meetings from December 15, 1814 to January 5, 1815 in Hartford, Connecticut, the United States, in which the New England Federalist Party met to discuss the grievances concerning the ongoing War of 1812 and the political problems arising from the federal government's increasing power. This convention discussed removing the 3/5 compromise. That was something that the Northerners hated because it gave Southerners representation in Congress on the basis of slavery. Whereas these people did not have a right to vote in the South. They counted towards white people representation of the Southerners in the U.S. Congress. So it gave southern states disproportionate power in the Congress, and there were a lot of gimmicks that they tried to do. One of the gimmicks that they tried to do was the creation of the state of Maine. Maine was part of Massachusetts, and it separated into a separate state just so that the Northerners would balance the expansion that the Southerners made into Kentucky, Tennessee. A similar thing was sort of the statehood of the state of Vermont. The people from Vermont and Maine will forgive me, but a huge reason for their statehood. Obviously, they were not part of the original 13 colonies, but they were created so that the Northerners have equal representations to these large states that were created in the South. And more were on the way. It wasn't just Kentucky and Tennessee, but it was Alabama, it was Mississippi, it was Florida, it was Louisiana, it was Texas, the big enchilada coming in, it was Arkansas, it was Missouri, and so on and so forth. So all of these were slave states, and it really worried the Northerners. To such an extent that at this Hartford Convention, they basically wanted to leave the Union. And there is your Civil War in a nutshell. This is happening in 1815, but it's going to keep happening again all the way to 1861 when the Civil War erupts. And they're going to fight it out eventually. So basically, we've finished our course here. That's it. No, just kidding. But these issues are going to keep popping up. So we have the Federalists, to continue this about the Hartford Convention, the Federalists also discussed their grievances with the Louisiana Purchase and the embargo 1807. Those are issues that they didn't like, and for the same reason. It was an attempt by the mercantile-oriented Federalists in the North to secede from the Union, to leave the Union. However, the news of Major General Andrew Jackson's overwhelming victory in New Orleans swept over Northeast, people, discrediting and disgracing the Federalists, resulting in their elimination as a major national political force. I'm not sure to what extent this is true. Yes, the Federalist Party after 1815 sort of practically ceased to exist, but it appears in another form. It is going to appear as the Northern Democrats, or it's going to appear as the Whig Party, or eventually as the National Republicans, or this and that party that popped up later, or as the Republican Party under Lincoln. But it's the same issue: industrial Northeast versus rural South, agrarian South. So that's about the political issues. I just want to add a couple of things on this over the slides 23 and 24, which is going to be a bit of an introduction to our Friday lecture. So I'm going to extend this a little longer, so the Friday lecture is short, and it has to do with two visions of the country. The theme that we started. And it has to do with geography. Look at slide number 23. We have the Mississippi River Basin. And you have there on the left side of the Mississippi going from Minneapolis, Minnesota, right? Minneapolis, Minnesota, you have the tributaries of the Mississippi: Wisconsin River, Illinois River, Ohio River, Tennessee River. Those are huge rivers that flow into the Mississippi. Those rivers are navigable. You can use a boat to load the cotton and other agricultural products and take them down to Memphis and New Orleans. On the right side of the Mississippi, the west side of the Mississippi, you have the Missouri River, the Arkansas River, and the Red River. It's a huge amount of territory, and that is not just the South, it's also a large part of the American Midwest. A lot of Midwestern states, actually, especially southern parts of those parts that are close to the river, like southern parts of Illinois, close to the Mississippi River, or southern parts of Indiana, close to the Ohio River, or even southern parts of Ohio, like Cincinnati, which is on the Ohio River, are closer to the American South than what we call the Midwest. The Midwest actually is going to emerge in our next chapter. We'll talk more about this for the next time around. So this is geography. So the Mississippi River Basin is framed on the east by Appalachian Mountains and on the west by Rocky Mountains. So between these two mountains, there are these Great Plains of America, through which flows this river and empties down into New Orleans. It goes through the city of New Orleans and empties into the Gulf of Mexico. And this was the land of cotton, the land of tobacco, other agricultural products, rice, grain, wheat, you name it. So this is the land which Jefferson liked. That's why he bought New Orleans. On the other hand, you have slide 24 and the Erie Canal. Erie Canal is a canal that, as you see on the map, that follows from Troy, New York, near Albany. From Troy, New York, it follows the Mohawk River all the way west towards Oswego, Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo. And it connects Lake Erie and Lake Ontario with the Erie Canal, with the Hudson River down to New York. So I'm talking about waterways here. The one is the great waterway of the Mississippi River Basin, which created places like Cincinnati, Ohio, St. Louis, Missouri, Memphis, Tennessee, New Orleans, Louisiana. What am I missing here? That's pretty much big cities on the great rivers in the American South. Little Rock, Arkansas, Nashville, Tennessee, on the Cumberland River, Birmingham, Alabama, near Tennessee River. So all these places were connected through the riverways to the Mississippi and down to New Orleans. And then we have another great river road, the Erie Canal, that connects the Great Lakes. You have the route here. This is some sort of a cruise that I found. So it's not really a historical map, but it's a cruise that takes you from Chicago to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, through Lake Michigan, all the way north to Mackinac Island, and then into Lake Huron, from Lake Huron into a little lake here, St. Clair, to Detroit, and from Lake St. Clair down the Detroit River to Lake Erie, and then to Buffalo. The Erie Canal came out of Buffalo right before the Niagara Falls. The Niagara Falls were a big problem for trading. So there was a canal that went, to Buffalo and bypassed the Niagara Falls, and then you can take a ship from Buffalo down to Cleveland. So these great cities that were built here were the cities of Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Cleveland, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Chicago, Illinois. Those were the great cities of what we call the Midwest, of the Great Lakes area. But these cities became linked through this waterway with New York through Erie Canal. And the Erie Canal was the vision of the governor of New York, Clinton DeWitt, who was an opponent. If you look at the, let me see where I have him here. Right. Slide number 19. Elections of 1812. Second term of James Madison. James Madison versus Clinton DeWitt. You have portraits of these two presidents. Well, Madison was a president. Clinton DeWitt was a governor of New York, but who was a leader of the Federalist Party, and whose sort of an obsession was to build this Erie Canal. And he was ridiculed for it. But he knew what he was talking about, because Erie Canal became extremely profitable and extremely useful to the Northeast and to the whole Great Lakes region. It was used to transport a lot of things, including wheat to feed the population of New York, including iron and other ores that were being mined in the upper Midwest, particularly in the areas like Wisconsin and then Michigan. And this Great Lakes, with the extension into Erie Canal, and the other extension goes down the St. Lawrence River into Canada, built two great societies, one in Canada and one in the United States. That society was based on industry and trade. And this is in contrast to the Mississippi River Valley that you see here on the chapter 23, which is Agrarian America. So anyways, this is as much as I have for you guys. It's a little bit more than just one lecture, but I wanted to add a couple of things for Friday. On Wednesday, we'll do the IDs, so we'll pick up some of these people and learn more about them, including the beautiful Indian chief Tecumseh. That's, we need to learn more about. So anyways, that's what I have for you for now on Monday for chapters 7 and 8. And I'll see you tomorrow on Zoom. And that's about it. See you guys. Bye.